This is Erwin Offenberg of the National Association of Black and White Men Together, and Les Everett, and we are interviewing Douglas Noble, who has been affiliated with the National Association of Black and White Men Together since 1983, first through the Los Angeles chapter, and later his work on the national board since 1989. Welcome, Douglas.
Thank you.
How did you first hear about Black and White Men Together?
I heard about it through a friend that I worked with who was actually Asian American, interestingly enough, probably in the early 80s, at a time when we were out to each other, and he knew that I was interracially interested and basically had no social life, and he suggested that he'd heard of this group and thought maybe I would like to join it. But it took me, it was at least a year or two from the time he first mentioned it to when I got up the courage to go to a meeting at BWTLA in May of 1983.
What was that first meeting like?
It was a revelation. And I've said this many times in white caucuses when we've been owning up to our racism and our prejudice, but I remember distinctly being overwhelmed not only by the number of extremely attractive black men there, but at the high level of discussion in the rap. It was a rap, a Saturday rap, which our chapter always had. And I guess I just went expecting to see some pretty faces and not much else, and of course I was pleasantly surprised, and I think very soon thereafter realized that I'd been harboring a few prejudices and stereotypes of what it wouldn't or would be.
And would you say that was the main reason that you returned after that first meeting?
Well, I was, I think almost from the beginning I realized that not only was this a place to meet people, which was the reason I went originally, I think it's the reason most people go, but it really fit in, and I realized it almost immediately with my politics, my interests in civil rights, which frankly had always been sort of a non-activist interest, but I knew right away, I'm sure I saw the statement of purpose early on, and I knew early on that this was a group that I really was interested in. I cared about what the group cared about, and so very quickly it was something much more to me than just an opportunity to meet men. I joined. We had an education committee in the LA chapter, and I remember I went to an early meeting of that committee because the chair of it was someone that I thought was rather attractive. And I went to the meeting, it was probably within the first month I was there, and I was the only white man attending the meeting, and the next thing I knew I was co-chair of the education committee. And I was involved almost from the beginning. I started going to steering committee meetings, and I became a delegate to the convention in '85. Well, that's getting a little ahead. But from almost the beginning, one, I knew that I really liked what the group stood for, and two, partly because of that, and partly because of wanting to meet people, or particular people, I got involved early on in committee work and in the steering committee of the chapter.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the LA chapter at that time. Who were some of the personalities that were there, and what was, the size of the group?
Well, the co-chairs at that time were Colin Gibson and Will Henderson. Colin later was the treasurer of the National, and he's still involved. He's still at this convention. Will has lost track of him many years ago. He moved to San Francisco. Charles Stewart, who had been the first black chair of the National, or then the International Association, which I had no connection with at that time. Charles, even by then, had not taken an active role in our chapter affairs, except he would show up occasionally to tell us what we should be doing. And he certainly showed up to tell us that we should host the 1985 convention. Again, that's getting a little ahead. We had two fairly strong co-chairs. We had a lot of committees. And our most important function, as it always was until our chapter really began falling apart in the late 90s, was the Saturday night raps. We had a rap every Saturday night at the Gay and Lesbian Community Service Center in Los Angeles, unless the Saturday was Christmas or Thanksgiving or New Year's. you could count on us having a rap, and they were good raps. And even though the quality of the facilitators would vary from year to year, we had good attendance, and it was our central meeting point. And usually after the raps, we'd adjourn to a restaurant or get something to eat. And we had social events too. Those first years, we had a very active social committee. We had what were called Zodiac parties. Once a month, we had a party after the rap at somebody's house, and there would be a birthday cake for everybody that was, I guess, under that sign or that month. And you could count on that once a month. And that was the first couple of years I was involved. And then we would have potlucks on Sundays, and then there were other, specific events like on Halloween or St. Patrick's Day or something like that. And then I guess there were other events too, like beach outings. But
sounded like a pretty active chapter.
It was a very active chapter. Oh, you asked how many members there were. I think, I've never verified this, but I've always been told that we once had 140 members. When I was involved and knew what was going on, we had around 100 pretty consistently.
And how did you first hear about the National Association as a national entity?
I heard about it on our steering committee. Charles, as I said, Charles Stewart would come occasionally, and Colin Gibson was active in the National. And I distinctly remember we used to meet up in the attic of an old frame house on a hilltop in downtown Los Angeles, right near Dodger Stadium. Several members of the chapter lived there, and two members, Warren Timoney and Stephen Durrell, rented this house. And then there were Colin and Will Henderson and a few other people lived in this nearby apartment. And the whole area was called BWMT Hill. And our chapter rented the attic of the house that Stephen and Warren lived in, and we had our steering committee meetings there. And you walked up this very precipitous staircase. If you'd ever missed a step, you would have plunged to your death down the hill. But anyway, we had our steering committee meetings there, and I can remember distinctly, and I guess it was the Columbus convention, because Colin was co-chair. It was right after I joined, and Colin was going to go to the convention in Columbus in 1983, and I remember I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but he was modeling some sort of a pajama suit that he was going to wear, and it was clear to me that there were all kinds of activities going to go on in these dorms where the convention was to be held in. Orgy kind of activities, and I thought, oh, this is not my type of gathering. And I thought, well, it sounds nice for them, but I'll just keep coming to these steering committee meetings here and enjoy myself that way. And frankly, I probably never would have gone to a convention if the LA chapter at Charles's goading hadn't agreed to host the 1985 convention, and that was when I really got involved with the NA. I'd been involved with our chapter for about 2 years. I'd been doing various things. I hadn't been co-chaired by that time, but I'd done a number of things in the chapter. But the 85 convention was held at the Quality Inn on Century Boulevard by the LA airport, probably the worst possible location that an NA convention has ever been held at. I mean, there was nowhere to walk around there, and it was a cramped little hotel. But it was a great convention, full of content. I mean, Charles and Colin were the program chairs of the convention, and Stephen Durrell was the convention chairman. And at that time, there was no NA board of directors. There was the House of Delegates. Each chapter had 2 delegates, and Gavin Morrow Hall was one of our delegates. And Gavin was a very attractive young man, and I was certainly attracted to him, as probably were all the white men in our chapter and a few more. And we had become friends pretty early on, and he was convinced that I should come to the convention as the LA delegate, the other delegate. I said, well, all right, I would do that. And then he proceeds to tell me, this is sort of a gradual unfolding of my getting sucked into work. Then he informed me that, because of course there was no board then, all the business of the House was done by the delegates. They were actually the committees in the House, and he was the election committee. And it was only natural that I, as his co-delegate, would be co-chair of the election committee. Okay, well that sounded fine. He knew what was going on. I would just be helping out. So we went to the convention. Almost immediately in the House of Delegates, I guess it was John Bush who proposed creating a board of directors.
Yes.
With 12 directors to be elected for the first time to supplement the then 4 officers. We didn't have a corresponding secretary. We had 2 co-chairs and a treasurer and a recording secretary. And so suddenly there were going to be these 12 directors added to these 4 officers to create a board of directors to run the organization in between conventions, because of course the House of Delegates only met at convention. Well, this was voted in, and suddenly there was going to be an election, not of what we're doing now, maybe 6 delegates every year, or 6 directors, but 12 directors. And guess what? Gavin decided to run. And guess who was left holding the bag?
You.
I was the election committee. I'd never been to a convention. I'd never dealt with our arcane and Byzantine method of counting votes or anything, or racial or geographic parity, and and no one in the organization at that time had ever conducted an election where 12 directors had to be elected. So I said, well, what was I going to say? So I did it. And Francis Gibson, then of Cleveland, was appointed to be my co-chair of the committee, and I drove him nuts. There was no doubt about it. I was very legal and anal and everything you want, and Francis wasn't, and I drove him nuts. But anyway, we got the job done. There were 12 directors elected, of course, by our voting system. They had to be ranked 1 through 12, and counting the ballots. Fortunately, my good friend in L.A., Dan Duncan, who was computer-wise, rigged up some system for counting the votes that prevented us probably from having to spend a whole day counting these votes, because a lot of people were running. I mean, these were the days when we didn't have problem getting candidates. So we conducted the election, and I still remember that there's been talk in some of these other interviews about the dramatic Black Caucus at that convention over the Atlanta flag issue. But I remember that I had to walk into the Black Caucus at the very end of it and announce the election results. Francis walked into the White Caucus and announced them, and I walked into the Black Caucus, and here I was in this room. I was an unknown at this convention, and there were all these beautiful men in there, and I walked in, and I have a stuttering problem, which only occurs on very rare occasions, but it certainly occurred there, and it was quite awful. No one else remembers it. I remember it. Anyway, John Bush did compliment me on how I handled the thing, which I thought was he was sparse with his compliments, but that was nice. So we got the board elected, and I guess that's when I really got to know Stephen Matchett. I began making friends, and it's funny, I sort of remember each convention by who I really hung out with, who I suddenly found was a good friend, and I remember I really got to know Stephen at that convention. I don't think I know you, Irwin, at that time very well, and Les hadn't started coming to conventions. But that was the beginning, and I've been to every convention since. In fact, I think I've been involved in every election since, except when I've run for the board, which probably there's some people that would like to end that practice. But
Did you get involved at all with the Confederate flag controversy?
well, I was there, and I think I was part of the shock. I can't say that I was one of the first people that rose up in indignation. I mean, that came from the New York chapter, clearly. But I was certainly on the side of those who did not understand what Atlanta was doing. And while over time you begin to, I mean, everything has 2 sides. I still have difficulty understanding why in a national organization where people coming from various parts of the country to get together around a common statement of purpose, nevertheless wouldn't recognize that they have some regional differences, maybe different sensitivities, and be aware of other people's sensitivities. And I think in this case, while certainly the people from Atlanta, at least some of them, took pride in their state flag, which was what was being shown. It wasn't just a Confederate flag, it was the Confederate flag that's part of the state flag. It was very obvious that this was a matter of great hurt to a number of people, and I felt the insensitivity of the Atlanta chapter in failing, or the people, whoever people were to do it, was not something I could buy, and it, of course, caused a big break for many years. I mean, that probably could have been handled better on all sides, but I basically did not condone what was done.
Now, I've heard several different accounts when you talk about the flag incident of exactly what this was all about and exactly what happened. Do you know exactly what happened?
I don't know exactly what happened. In fact, I was talking to someone about this just today, and we had talked to we did an interview with Alonzo Wade yesterday. I thought it was in the roll call of chapters that they did it. In those days, every chapter would be called and they'd stand up. There were more general meetings of the House, but apparently it was at some sort of a reception or something that their chapter hosted, and they paraded out the flag. I'm just not sure. That, you know, all I know is that it was at a time where their chapter had a chance to express itself in some way, and that's how they chose to do it.
You've been involved with elections for many, many years. How has the board changed over the years in terms of the quality and quantity of people running for it, in your opinion?
Well, other than that first time in '85, when I think there were more people running than there were slots, there's always been a little bit of a struggle to get enough candidates. When Gavin was running elections, and then we ran them together a couple times, his view was always that you try to go out and actively recruit, and I sort of followed that view for a while. Try to actively recruit and make sure there are enough people running. But I've learned over the years that I don't think that works. I think when you try to dragoon people into running who aren't self-motivated enough to do it, you're likely to get someone on the board that isn't motivated enough to do the work. And so over the years, the board, well, I think we've always had some problems getting enough leadership on the board, and lately it's been a serious lack of black leadership. And I've seen it, I think I've seen it on the NA board as well as at the chapter level. I mean, we've had some very strong African American leaders at the top, both probably stronger than the white leadership at the top, generally speaking, both in our chapter and at the national board level. But at the middle levels, I think that's where it's been lacking. I don't really know the explanation of that. It's an observation. This year at the election, you know, for the last 4 or 5 years, we've always had one or two more white candidates than could sit on the board because of our racial parity limits. And there were several elections in a row where every black candidate for director automatically won, no matter how few votes or how many votes they got, simply because there were the slots. So that says to me that there's still a lack of enough black candidates, which is really unfortunate in an organization that prides itself on racial parity, and I don't know if, I guess we all have to take responsibility for that.
What are some of your feelings around that single issue? I know there's not a lot of organizations today that dwell on the parity type operation.
Well, it's kind of counter the whole movement away from affirmative action or whatever, but I think it's right. I think I'm not sure. We've made some qualifications to it. We've made qualifications the last couple of years to avoid having vacant offices. The secretary and treasurer positions if to enforce racial parity would result in a vacancy. And I think that is almost a concession to reality that we have to make, because we can't afford not to have a treasurer or a secretary in our organization. But I think generally speaking, it's a good idea. I think to the extent that empowerment is kind of a overused word, but to the extent that I think there is still a problem with black men, especially younger black men, maybe feeling that they can compete or take authority in an organization, or whatever limitations there are on them coming forward. I think to the extent that we have racial parity requirements is an incentive to do that. And I'm afraid if we didn't have it, that we would end up with a very out of balance board, out of balance white board, because I think maybe this is very PC to say it, but I think white men generally, and to the extent that the white men in this organization seem to often be older than the black men for a variety of reasons that I guess we could theorize about, they would be more apt to see themselves in a position of authority, and therefore more apt to run. So I think we need to add those incentives to try to get some balance.
Now, okay. Since you have served on the board for such a long, extended period of time, I'm quite sure that you are well versed in all of the major things that have taken place in the organization. What have been some of the most troubling issues or times for you during your time?
Well, I mean, I guess the most troubling was before I was ever on the board, and that was the name change debate, which nearly fractured the organization in '87. But it didn't. It didn't. That was the good news. It took, and it's interesting how over the years, that's, even though it's still an issue to some people, it turned out to be less of an issue than many of us thought it would be. In 1996 in Cleveland, when the issue was brought up again, we had, after the 1987 debate, at which the name change was rejected, and we remained the National Association of Black and White Men together, there was sort of a tentative agreement by the House of Delegates that the issue would not be raised again in the House until more than half the chapters, local chapters, had changed their names. Well, by 1996 that had happened, and so I think it was the Philadelphia chapter that made a motion to bring it up again. And I remember, I mean, we were on the board together there thinking about, oh, this potentially could fragment the organization again. How are we going to handle this? How are people going to vote? Well, when push came to shove, in fact, we were so concerned, and I'll take ownership of this overreaction here. I was so concerned that it was going to result in some cataclysmic debate that we recommended creating a committee to study it for a year and bring it back the next year so it wouldn't fracture the House. Well, of course, and the board bought into that. So that was our recommendation to the House. And when we got in there, into the House, they said, we don't need a committee. We don't want to change our name. And that's it. And they got rid, and then the issue has gone away and it's not come back. And there's still some people that would like to change the name, but I think it's now a dead issue. And to me, it's been a dead issue for years. I mean, I've seen my own chapter. I've changed my mind twice on this locally. I've never changed my mind nationally. I've never thought the National should change its name. But locally, I went back and forth. And I think ultimately, I know a name is important, and I think the name we have is the right name and the name we should keep. But I've always felt that much too much energy was spent on the name change and far too little on what we were actually doing. It's always been clear to me that our membership was going to be primarily black and white, and even when I supported a name change in the LA chapter, I did not do it for the reason that I thought it would change our membership. I did it for the reason that I thought it would at least invite people and let them know we were concerned and we weren't just limited in our concerns to black and white men. But I think most people, when they voted for it, somehow thought that it would change our membership, and it hasn't, and I don't think it ever would have. But Other issues, I guess, clearly financial issues over the years have always been troubling. Not just whether we had enough money, but whether we were properly taking care of our books, making our filings, when we had an employee, whether we were doing the right things in terms of withholding taxes and paying things. And I guess I as a lawyer shouldn't be saying this, but I don't really know stuff like that. And there was this, not that I was ever in charge of doing this, but I was part of the board that was responsible for doing this. And I think there was a sense for many years, I had this sense of disquiet that, well, what cataclysmic event is going to be disclosed to us at the next board meeting that we've screwed up on? I'll clean up my language. I mean, for a few years there, it was like every meeting there was something new that we discovered that we hadn't done that was all screwed up. And in addition to the fact that we were always struggling for money, and frankly, the Michael Smith Trust has, changed everything in this organization. It's allowed us to have an office that we never would have had otherwise. I think that's been a major, major event in this organization, is to get an office, to get some sort of an institutional setting that carries on our work, as co-chairs and leadership varies and comes and goes, but if we have an office that sustains us and that's functioning, and I think finally we do, and also finally I think we have a financial position where we're at least in compliance with things. We're always going to be underfunded, I think. And I think, but at least now I think we're as close to being in compliance with various regulations and laws as we've ever been. And we also have a functioning office. Financially, though, I think we've been laboring under, I think we've stopped laboring under the assumption. But I think for years we just assumed that if we just did a better job of fundraising or grant writing or something, that money would start pouring in and we would be able to grow and become a huge organization. I just don't think that was ever realistic, and I might be accused of being a small thinker on that, and in fact, you might even accuse me of that, Les, but I think we've overestimated our ability to raise money, and I think the Michael Smith Trust has been a great, great boon to us, and hopefully it will continue to be. Other issues of import over the years, I think the biggest change that's really occurred, well, on the board, I think we've definitely become more professional, and I don't want to embarrass you, but I will. I think you were largely responsible for that because you brought some planning into the organization. We'd had planning committees before, but they've been a little bit unfocused, I thought, and your 5-year plan and actually giving people things to do and raising expectations of board directors, I think, made a huge, huge difference. I also think that as a board, and I'll take part of the credit for this, I think we knew that we needed to focus more and not be scattered. Al Benvenuti, just in an interview I just did, said he thought one of the weaknesses of the organization was that we had too broad a statement of purpose, and I'm not sure that's a weakness. I think it's fine to have a broad statement of purpose, but it's how you implement it. It's what where you folks choose to focus your energies. And I think for years, I can remember in the New York convention, at some meeting, we listed a whole bunch of things we thought we needed to do, and my God, it was an endless list, and we were going in every direction. And I think finally, the last 5 years or so, or maybe more, we've decided that we really can focus on racism. And we have homophobia and AIDS and sexism and everything else necessarily included in our statement of purpose. But I think our area, and our natural area of focus is fighting racism in the gay community. And goes with that too, homophobia in the black community, but I think our primary message, the thing that we know most about, is fighting racism as a gay organization. And because it's obvious to me, as it never was, I never even really thought of it before I joined this organization, to be honest. I just had no idea of extent of racism in the gay community. That was perhaps due a lot to the fact that I wasn't really part of the gay community. But I remember that was one of the more profound early revelations I had when I joined our chapter. Was I can remember discussions about why there are simply no black gay bartenders in such and such a city, or in so and so, or there were national surveys and there weren't any. And I thought, well, that's bizarre, but it's true. And I think that's our message. And I think since we focused on that, and particularly with the Multiracial, Multicultural Institute, I mean, we finally have a program. We finally have something where, and we can take to our chapters and say, we don't need your money, we don't need your support just to run an office, just to keep us afloat. We need it because we're also doing a program. We're doing something that actually implements our statement of purpose, both inside and now outside the organization. And I think that's great, and that's a major change in the last few years.
You've mentioned the Los Angeles convention and the New York convention. Are there any other conventions that stand out in your mind?
Well, because I know how these interviews work, I went through and wrote down things I remembered from each convention. And I
All right, let's start with
well, the LA
Milwaukee.
convention, well, New York actually was the convention where I decided, because of a sort of a attraction I had for one of the other attendants, that I was not going to indulge in that sort of thing and ruin my conventions after that. And I didn't, and I've had a much better time since then. I'll tell you the thing I remember about the New York convention that I will never forget, and it wasn't really part of the convention. It's funny thinking about this. Some people I know remember speeches and workshops and being revved up. And frankly, I'll have to admit I've never been very revved up by polemics, and in fact turned off by them, and I think it's just a sort of a necessary evil that we have to have them at our conventions. But and I know it's necessary. But the things I tend to remember more, and I'm not saying this to downplay our statement of purpose, which I thoroughly support, but I think the things I remember more are the people that I got to know and some of the things I did. And I'll tell you, in New York, the thing I will never forget was, I think that convention was held over the 4th of July also. And one of the members from the New York chapter conducted a walking tour of Harlem, which was directly below where we stayed, because we stayed at Columbia University on Morningside Heights. In fact, I could look right out my dorm window and look right down into Harlem. And he conducted a walking tour, and there were about, I think there were 7 of us, and it was 4 to 3. It was almost racial parity. And it was very interesting, because we walked around, and there wasn't a lot of foot traffic for whatever reason. And I remember we walked down 125th Street, the Apollo Theater, and the Schoenberg Center, and I remember we walked up another street there were some very beautiful old homes that had been very well kept up, and of course, a block away then there were tenements that weren't. But the thing I'll never forget is that the guy who conducted the tour had a cleaning lady. He didn't live in this area, but he had a cleaning lady who lived right at the lower end of Harlem, just north of Central Park, and he wanted to deliver her a message, and he hadn't been able to get her on the phone. So he took us by her apartment, and she lived in a tenement. I mean, it looked okay from the outside, but he went in to see her, and someone in our group, I think it was one of the white men, said, "Gee, I wonder if we could go in." And I thought, well, that's kind of intrusive, but this guy said, "Oh no, she wouldn't mind." And we walked into this building, and this was a revelation. I mean, we went up the elevator. It smelled of urine. I mean, it was awful. Walked into this woman's apartment. I think her husband was there, and it was an old apartment. The furniture was pretty ratty. I remember her telling us about having to watch out for rats coming into her children's beds at night. I mean, that left a profound effect on me. I knew these things were there, but I'd never seen them, and I was there and saw it, and that was pretty amazing. I'll never forget that. There were other things at that convention. I think that was where John Bush, I think that was the first time I saw him really do a dance on stage when he was trying to raise money, although at the Los Angeles convention in '85, I'm sure you remember this, Erwin. We had a pool party at the home of one of our members,
Oh, yes.
where I remember once one of my friends from the LA chapter, one of my white friends from LA said, well, you know, at pool parties and things like this, and we'd had other pool parties at this man's house, which was very secluded, so it was very private, and I remember this guy saying to me, well, it's only the white men that take off their clothes at these things. Black men never do that. Well, this pool party from the convention dispelled that notion once and for all. I mean, it wasn't a lot of people that took off their clothes, but it was enough to make an impression. And John Bush did a dance on the side of the pool with somebody. Do you remember that? It was it was almost like a mating ritual, and I don't remember who it was he was doing it with, but it was quite unforgettable. Anyway, that's the LA convention. New York convention. I'm going to look at some notes here I wrote, because this is an informal interview, and I don't want to miss talking about these things, and I'm probably running up the time here. But,
You're doing fine.
But, well, at all these conventions, in New York, too, of course, we marched in the Gay Pride Parade, which started at Central Park, and we walked down Fifth Avenue all the way to the Village.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also, during that convention, was when the Supreme Court decision in the Georgia sodomy case came down. And I remember there was a big demonstration downtown, although I don't think, we weren't down there when it happened. There was another time, but I remember that happened during that convention. The Milwaukee convention in '87, of course, the name change debate. I mean, it was really awful. It was awful. People on both sides were pretty awful to each other. Mike Smith, who felt passionately about keeping the name, lashed out at Steve Feeback, who was the primary promoter of the name change from the New York chapter, and a very personal attack. And everybody was questioning each other's motives, and it wasn't just a disagreement. It was really questioning motives and where you were coming from, and very basic stuff. And I even remember having a real set-to with at the end of my co-delegate from LA. I was the NA delegate, and our chapter voted about 4-1 against changing the name, and I voted against changing the name. But the other delegate, Bobby Smith, who was a good friend of mine, that felt very strongly about changing the name, and he voted the other way. And I remember, and as I say, none of us behaved well. I include myself. I remember sort of laying into him afterwards and saying, well, what about the chapter vote? You know, don't you represent the chapter? And he said, well, I had a right to vote my conscience, which he did, really. And I remember Gavin Morrow, who was very passionate for the name change. He particularly threatened me physically, because I don't know, I mean, it was really an awful environment. And then, after all that happened, the keynote speaker at the banquet was Joseph Beam. This was right before he died, I guess. And he gave a pretty strident speech. And Michael Warner, who was not yet co-chair, but he had some role at the banquet, I guess. I don't remember. Anyway, they practically got in a fight, didn't they, at the end? Or some great verbal battle. I mean, it was right at the end of the banquet. It was a hell of a way to end the banquet. So that was what I remember. I also remember attending board meetings there. I think I started attending board meetings even before I was on the board. I don't know what possessed me to do that. I also remember, as I say too, I remember the friends I made at conventions. I think that's where I first really got to know you.
We got to know each other.
Got to know Ed Dillard and Michael Warner, and I got to know Redvers Jean-Marie at that convention. And I remember it very well because by the next year he was already very ill and he was not himself. But I remember spending a lot of time talking to him. He was a wonderful man, and he was on the board. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't getting along with some of the other board members and felt very hurt by the way he'd been treated by some people that I know, and I won't mention names at this point. But I remember talking to him a lot. I remember also there was some sort of a festival down by the lake. Walking down to that, I don't know if it was some annual German festival or something.
No, it was the Summerfest, wasn't it?
Oh, was it?
Yeah,
oh, okay.
Yeah.
That was a great location. I think I liked that location about as well as any place we ever were, because we were like a block from the lake. It was a nice hotel. it was just very nice. And I think the mayor of Milwaukee had recognized us, and there was even a sign on the city hall, wasn't there?
Yeah.
I
Yes.
think. Yeah. Anyway, I forgot too. We bussed down to Chicago and walked in the Gay Pride Parade there,
In
and I
Chicago.
remember we had a lunch at a big restaurant there, and there was this there was this very attractive and sort of sandy-haired, tall, young black man that sat next to me at the lunch. And he started talking to me, and we talked some, and, I didn't think anything of it, and it all sort of went away, and nothing happened. And I remember afterwards, and I think it was Redvers I think he was sitting next to me, he said, "You idiot," he said, "that guy was interested in you." Oh my God. Well, anyway, and he was very attractive. Anyway, that was my story. Boston, I remember I shared a room with 3 other people, and we had 2 double beds, and thank God my roommate, who I will not mention, spent the entire week with somebody else, which made me very happy, but the 2 people in the other bed were having sort of a little liaison, and that's the last time I've shared a room with 3 other people. I spent a lot of time in the mornings. The hotel was near the Boston Public Garden, and I think that was I don't know why, but I felt a certain sense of alienation that year I don't know what was in my head, but I know that was the first year I felt that I had permission not to attend all the workshops. And I also went over and sat in the public garden each morning and read the newspaper. And I guess for some reason I felt the need to sort of have some space and get away. And I don't really remember why. Maybe it was because I didn't have my own room. But I remember the public garden was a block away, and it's a beautiful place. And I just remember sitting there, and it was very nice. I also remember walking back from some luncheon meeting past some construction workers that were making remarks.
A Chinese restaurant. Do you remember we ate in that Chinese restaurant?
guess I
and we
do,
had
but
to walk past those construction
Yeah, and they
workers.
made some remarks, and that was also the year we sang some song about onions in the lobby because the hotel personnel, every year for a number of years we had a cause. There was some cause every year. Of course, in Dallas it was the performer that talked about fish in the bar. In Detroit it was the radio station, the TV station that wouldn't run Marlon Riggs's film, and in Boston it was some of the hotel personnel that were not pleasant to us, and so John Bush got us into the lobby and we sang this song about onions, or we gave them onions. Wasn't that it?
Right.
Anyway, this was always my type of thing. Anyway, we did that. We did that every year. Tallahassee was a trip and a half. I mean, we had to bring our own pillowcases, or pillows, didn't we? And I didn't bring a pillow, so I wadded up my dirty clothes and put them in a bag and lay on them in my bed. I think the thing I remember most about that, besides the 2 teddy bears, of course, that were hanging from the window, the brown and the white teddy bear hanging from the net from a dorm window, was very inviting.